Hello, everyone. So, welcome to Navigating Housing Insecurity in Women in Midlife and Beyond. So, I'm really pleased to introduce our special guests. We've got Vida Bloom, Susan Hawkswood, sharing their lived experience, and our expert today is Wendy Stone. And we're going to hand straight over to Wendy. Over to you, Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to join you all today. And I would also just like to start by acknowledging, paying respect to the elders, past, present, emerging on the land which I'm coming from today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm in Melbourne. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really just setting the scene, I think, for the real experts in the room, which are people with lived experience of housing insecurity and risk of homelessness in midlife and beyond. So what I'm going to do is share my screen in a minute, and this is just some key findings from research collaboration between Swinburne University, where I'm based, and Curtin University in WA, and Western Sydney University. And our research team was funded by the Housing for the Aged Action Group to have a look at really trying to put some numbers and figures around the scale of the issues that we're talking about today. And so what I'm not going to do is get into the nuance and the experience of living with housing insecurity or the risk of housing insecurity. But I think the value of looking at the larger picture is exactly that. Our research really shifts the focus from thinking about issues of housing insecurity as an individual problem to a societal problem. And we can really see when we look at the scale of just how prevalent housing insecurity is for people over 55 in our research. And a very large proportion of whom are women, we really start to shift and budge that narrative about what have people done wrong, what errors have people made, what is wrong with anyone, because we can clearly see at a systematic level the scale of these issues means that there's structural problems. Our system, as it is at the moment, is causing harm. And unfortunately, people are experiencing this in their own everyday life, but the problem is a structural, societal, systemic one. And I just want to walk you through very quickly some of the numbers around this to give you a sense of the scale. So I'll share my screen, just bear with me. Let's do this quickly. And I'll set this up. And I won't spend too much of our time today on the numbers, but just to let you know that we did look at the last population census data and the last National Homelessness estimates, which were all kind of collected around 2021. As we all know, since 2021, the situation has actually just worsened significantly. We're kind of falling off a cliff in Australia with the housing situation at the moment. So everything I'm presenting today, I think, is an underestimate, actually, of the scale of these issues. And so please just keep that in mind. But what I think these figures will really point to is just the scale. So this report that I'm presenting from is also publicly available from the Housing for the Aged Action Group website. Anyone can download it. It's really publicly available. So please feel free to go and have a look at the research on the website there. We looked at the numbers of people experiencing housing insecurity across the housing system. So we took a 10-year view, and we weren't interested only at looking at homelessness figures or estimates, because homelessness is really the very, very extreme pointy tip of the iceberg of housing failure, a systemic policy failure across the housing system. So what we did was try to really take not only a national view of who is affected at a whole population level, but thinking about how the housing system is changing over time, looking at even the decline in home ownership, the increase in private rental, decline in social housing and public housing, and how this is all feeding into this really, really challenging funnel of housing precarity and homelessness. It's all happening in the context of population aging. This first slide is basically just indicating that really our population as a whole in this country is aging. So at a time when housing has never been more difficult for older people, more older people are affected than ever before. Fewer older people now live in homes that are owned outright without a mortgage or any debt than we've had in decades in Australia. So some of you will know that previous sort of housing policies were really set up and established after World War II. Those policies prioritised home ownership and home purchase, and the development of Australian suburbs, and that kind of whole the whole idea of the great Australian dream was really established as an economy building, a social, society building rebuild after the Second World War. In the 1990s, financial aspects of the housing system were deregulated under the Howard government. And since then, we've had a really catastrophic impact in terms of housing prices rocketing, people being able to invest in housing, and really this financialization of housing. So what it means for people who perhaps get to midlife, later life, and they may have divorced, they've had a serious illness, perhaps they've never been an owner. It's actually just incredibly difficult to pay off a mortgage with the cost of those mortgages, rate rises, etc. So fewer people have that safety net. And the age pension is actually based on the assumption that everybody by later life in Australia will actually have their home paid off. So the age pension is actually set on the presumption that people do not have to pay any housing cost with that pension and benefit. So there's a real problem immediately there. As fewer people own their own homes, we see an increase in people living with mortgages in later life. This is hugely problematic. That slide into mortgage distress is really prevalent when people are living with fixed incomes, particularly aged pension, even a partly funded sort of pension setup for older people means that incomes are fixed, but rates are going up, the cost of living is going up, and people are falling out of home ownership from mortgage stress. Where they tend to fall out is into the private rental sector. In this period between 2011 and 2021, we actually saw a 73% increase in the number of older people aged 55 and over living in privately rented housing. And I think we'd all have to be living under a rock at the moment if we weren't hearing a lot in the media and in the news about just how difficult the private rental sector is. It's difficult if you're a young professional couple with high incomes, let alone anyone who has a cat, a dog, children, retirement income, living with disability or care. It's really, really difficult to compete. There's simply not enough private rental homes available for people. And the cost of private rental has just skyrocketed. We don't have a cap on rental cost, and we have very, very record low vacancy rates. We know from our research that actually there's just quite pervasive discrimination that can take place as well against older people living in private rental, as well as those other populations I mentioned, anyone with caring responsibilities or lower income. This is really precarious. We all know in Australia our rental setup is just not fit for purpose, particularly for ageing well. So private rent is increasingly unaffordable. We have many, many older people living in severely unaffordable housing in Australia at the moment. These are people going without heating, going without food, going without many things that really people depend on, going without medication, absolutely essential items just to maintain that shelter. These are just some of the faces of that story that appeared in our research. We'll hear more directly today some of these stories. So fewer older people are living in social housing. Social housing provides a really amazing safety net. It's a guaranteed lower rent, but there are only fewer than 4% of Australian households that live in social housing in Australia. So the number of social housing dwellings, even though we hear a lot about the investment in social housing, this simply is not keeping up with the demand for social housing, particularly for older people. We know from other research and research we've conducted in our case in Victoria, that often social housing is not fit for purpose either. It doesn't include the kind of universal design that people really need to live well within their homes.
2 minutes, Wendy.
Brilliant, thank you. So the sort of culmination of all of these forces of mortgage stress, private rental insecurity, not enough social housing, is that many more older people are experiencing homelessness or are marginally housed. This is absolutely a cliff and a shocking situation for our society. We've got around, and as I said, this is an estimate which I think is actually rapidly becoming out of date because of the sheer scale of the problem that we're seeing and the increase in costs. But at that 2021 estimate, we had around 270,000 older people in Australia who are homeless, marginally housed, or living with really severely unaffordable rental. The implications of our research really point to the systemic risks of housing insecurity and the need for system-wide solutions. When we talk about the delivery of, for example, affordable housing, what we don't need for older people is housing that's affordable at 80% of market rent or 80% of market value for home purchase. If you think about $1 million house, 80% of that would be $800,000 house. It's simply not affordable for anyone living on an aged pension or a fixed rate of salary or income. What we need are realistic, affordable housing for older people that is purposely designed for and with older people. And I think we'll hear about this more during our conversation today. And for now, I might just leave it there. I can circle back to any of these points in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That's all really great. Thank you for giving us the context and the landscape. So thank you. Let's go to Susan. So Susan's going to share her lived experience and then we will circle back to you, Wendy. Okay, over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Faith. My name's Susan Hawkeswood and I live in community housing in Sydney. I've been in my current unit for 14 years and it's provided a very stable base for me to improve my circumstances. I've studied, I've regained employment after 9 years of unemployment. The period leading up to me moving to this unit was very disconcerting. I was living in another community housing unit and there was a fire in the block, not in my unit, but a unit very close to my unit. The fire cracked the external wall. And so my unit was declared structurally unsound and I had nowhere to go. My housing provider thankfully provided me with temporary accommodation. And I'd like to say that I'm very grateful, I was very grateful for that accommodation. But the experience of being in temporary accommodation is harrowing. I moved twice. I was in a lodge and then I was moved to a studio unit and then I was moved back to the lodge again before finally there was a decision made not to move me back to my previous unit and to move me here. One of the experiences, the key experiences of temporary accommodation, especially when you're moving between a few places, you have to get used to new transport routes, where the shops are, and, you're not in a good place mentally. It was I felt insecure. I had a really acute feeling of insecurity. The studio unit that I was moved to had no external windows. It was very claustrophobic. And the only way to get air into that studio was through the air conditioning vents. So you had to make sure the air conditioning was on, or you didn't have any air. You ran out of oxygen. Now, the way it worked was you'd set a temperature, and when that temperature was reached, the air conditioning unit would automatically turn itself off and the vents would close. So my experience, I think the first or second night I was there, I went to sleep and I woke up in the early hours of the morning, gasping for air, like for breath. I was blue in the face and then I realized that the air vents were closed and I got them open again. That's just one experience in temporary accommodation. And it was the reason that I was moved back to the lodge, because I kept saying to them, well, I can't wake up every 2 hours to reset the air conditioning. I had a room at the lodge. Luckily, there were, laundry facilities. There was a kitchen I could cook in. So that was okay. But the experience of living with a bag of clothes in a room with a TV and a kettle, it's very upsetting, I think. It's better than a bus shelter, and I always say that. It was better than a bus shelter, but the experience of living in temporary accommodation after having had a community housing place to live in really upset me. The fire upset me, so that during that period of time I was, although not diagnosed, I think I was suffering from post-traumatic stress. After being evacuated, standing on the street for most of the night while the fire brigade fought the fire, which was a really major fire. And by the time that I moved into this unit here, I was emaciated. I was having panic attacks, which I'd been having at the lodge when I was living there. And I was both claustrophobic and agoraphobic at the same time. I felt like the months of being sort of closed up in one room had made me claustrophobic. But at the same time, whenever I left my unit, I would feel like panicky and need to go back home. So I was never, I suppose, at peace with myself, never at peace with myself. Of course, hanging over all of that was the spectre of homelessness and not being sure about whether I would get would I move back to my old place? Would I get a new place? So every day I just lived with this constant uncertainty that made me very panicky, very anxious. I think that the current situation, that current housing situation is very unnerving for many people. Older women in private rental are facing rent increases, although I've read that they're levelling off a bit now, but the massive rent increases that women are facing in private rental, the long wait times for social housing, all of these are contributing to uncertainty. I feel it myself, even though, I've been here 14 years, I have my own place. But even so, I feel insecure. I'm in a leasehold property, which means that my provider leases the unit off the private market and then subleases it to me. And I've been very fortunate to be in a unit that's owned by a company that doesn't want to sell. And so it's been very, I've had long-term security, unlike many other women in leasehold properties. But even so, I am affected by the private market. The private market issues really do affect my tenancy. And having had the benefits of stable housing for 14 years, where, I've studied, I've re-entered the workforce, I've been able to go from being broke to having savings in the bank. I still live with a feeling of uncertainty. What if the landlord cancels, ends the tenancy, where would I go? What if the rent is raised higher than my provider can afford? That is one of my concerns. Because if anything happens to this unit, I don't have an automatic right of rehousing. I would hope that I'd be rehoused, but I think that temporary accommodation, as good as it is, really creates long-term issues for women. Being moved from this place, that place, back there. You just my worst experience was going from the studio unit back to the lodge, which I'd been at before, and I came with my my bag and my shopping trolley, and by the time I got there, I was busting to go to the toilet, and I said, I had to do the sign in, the registering, and the woman behind the counter said, you have to do the and I said, look, can I just go to the loo? I'm busting. And she said, no. That's just one example of the sort of tyranny that people can impose on you, that I was busting to go to the toilet and I had to do the whole registration process before I could use a toilet. And I think that, to me, just sums up, some of the difficulties that women face. There was I in between temporary accommodation places, and I couldn't find a toilet, and I wasn't allowed to use a toilet. But at the same time, as I've said, very grateful to my provider for arranging the temporary accommodation and making sure that I wasn't on the street. That was important. If I'd been in private rental, I don't know what would have happened. It would have been a very different story. So that's my story. And I don't really have any more to say.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, that's very brave of you. I guess the main thing that I got was, even though that you're in a secure place now, that the feelings of insecurity still continues. And that must be really, really difficult to live with. So I just really appreciate you sharing that. We're going to go to Vida before we ask questions, okay? So, yeah, we're just going to hand over to you now, Vida. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Faith. My name's Vida. Back in the day, I was a nurse. I was living in Tasmania, paying off a mortgage. And then my mother in New Zealand, I always said I would be with her through her old age. So I moved to New Zealand, and I was in New Zealand for 10 years. During that time, the house in Tasmania was repossessed. So I spent 10 years with Mother, and being in New Zealand, I lost contact with most of my friends. In fact, all of them are friends. And then when I came back to Australia, at this stage, I was then on the pension, so that made me over 67 years old, and I didn't have accommodation. So I was bouncing around backpackers. Some of the backpackers, the staff were nice. Other backpackers, they were horrid. There was one particular one that said I could only stay there for 2 weeks because they didn't want us older Australians making it their home. So the last one, I was living in a 15-bed dorm, which means I'm sharing with some people that are there long-term because they've got a job. A lot of them were travellers, and the young travellers were just on holiday mode. You would have all sorts of things, including being kept awake all night while they had sex. But the other thing with staying in a dorm was you had to put up with the snores and all the other nighttime noises that goes on. So then while I was there, I also took up volunteering because I found that's what kept my sanity, getting out and mixing with normal people, helping the community. And I wasn't doing it for altruistic reasons. I was doing it for my own sanity. I never do anything for anyone else. I always do it for me. If they benefit from it, so be it. And while I was in the backpackers, for some reason or other, I was mucking about online and I was looking for housing for the aged, and that's when I came across HAG. So I made an appointment to come and see HAG. They then put me on to Launch Housing, a social worker at Launch Housing, who came and had a look at where I was staying and said, we can get you out of here, no trouble. If it's desperate, we'll put you into a motel for a couple of weeks while you find something. Now, I've always been very fortunate. I was on the fast track and I got into my current accommodation fast. The guy that was helping me, he'd ring up and I'd say, the answer's yes, what's the question? And I found by being cooperative, he went over and above. I'm currently living in a bedsit in a non-for-profit housing establishment. He found that for me. He found everything I needed. Microwave, fridge, bed, linen, cutlery. He found the lot. I still run with fear of the unknown. I mean, what if it all falls apart? Because that's what we do in our stage of life. We can't control anything anymore. It's all up to the powers of the unknown. So right now I'm living in a bedsit. I have a small kitchen and a bathroom. And it's not the ideal place, but it's comfortable. It's my own space. When I close the door, I'm in my own little cocoon. But still, I have to volunteer, because if I don't get out every day, I will go crazy. And like in any rental, there's neighbours you get on with and there's neighbours that you do not get on with. That's life. You'll find that anywhere. So since I've been there, because it's only a bedsit, I have never had visitors because I haven't got there is a communal room I can take visitors to, but then all the nosy neighbours jump on in. And there's nothing private, absolutely nothing private. They literally know when you went to the toilet last, because the neighbours next door and upstairs can hear the toilet running. I can hear the woman next door snoring. But I am still grateful, very, very grateful. I've been able to get on with my own life and source my own needs. Some of the bills are a bit expensive. I've had the gas disconnected on the stove because the last gas bill I got was $52. $2 of it was gas. So I disconnected the gas. I have a microwave. I have an electric fry pan. And when I go down the street and buy a packet of sausages, and I cook them all up and freeze them, because there's about 12 meals in one packet. I mean, I live by myself. I don't feed others. I don't know what else you want to know. You got any questions, Faith? What more do you want to know?
Well, thank you so much, Vida. That's great. I really love your positive attitude, and I can see how that's really contributed to how you've landed on your feet. And I loved what you said, that I've always been fortunate. It's really heard that.
I find if you stay positive, your helpers will give you more help. Because as soon as you bitch to a helper, they shut down. It's human nature.
Yeah. That's stuff that we can all learn, great attitude. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll go back to Wendy, because I know that, Wendy, you probably didn't get through yours. Why don't we go back to you for another, say, 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions. How's that sound?
That's fine. Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to really acknowledge to Susan and Vida your stories. I've been really fortunate to be partnering with HAG for a couple of years now, actually, in the research that we do, and that's meant that I've been able to spend time with older women in delegations where we've been taking lived experience stories and the evidence and advocacy to as many decision-making kind of sites as possible, including Parliament House and other places. So I really learn from hearing from you every time that happens. I guess just I agree the positive attitude is really important, and I've written down there's a really striking comments around I've always been very fortunate, or I feel grateful, and I think one of the kind of darker sides of that positivity, if you like, is that when we have a system that is actually just so under-resourced and so inadequate, that people are actually depending on these kind of good relationships. I think, this is there's a policy failure where people can't necessarily get the housing or the other support and services they need when that kind of goodwill, if you like, depends on discretion. It depends on just finding the right person who has time on that day or clicks with you in some personality kind of way. While that always helps, it's always lovely to get along with people every day. They're the moments which make the day nicer. We can all get brought down by negative moments, but when a whole policy system of housing actually depends on points in the system where people's discretion comes into play, we have a failed system, a broken system. So I think even though I do hear you and that sort of sense that that's fortunate, I think that's a really problematic aspect of what we know many people's experience is at the moment, whether that's about finding out about the information and resources that people need, whether it's access to temporary housing, whether it's access to a position in the social housing waiting list, or whether it's getting along with a real estate agent or a landlord who may like you at a personal level. I think these are all really problematic points in our system where we don't have an automatic right. And I think, one of the ways that the conversation is starting to shift in Australia is that we can start to increasingly hear about housing as a human right. Some of you may be keeping up with this sort of movement in legal terms and in political terms, and a lot of people like me coming from academic sectors have been also really engaging with this push toward us trying to get legislation in Australia that really pushes housing as a fundamental human right, just to really shift the moral kind of dial on this whole situation, because we know absolutely that people from birth to the grave, cradle to grave, we all need and value and benefit from secure, safe, adequate, appropriate housing. And we've heard in the stories today and shown in research over and over as well in other ways that when we invest in people's housing, we actually just gain so much, not only for that individual, but for the family of that person, as well as the community around them locally, like volunteering, Vida's, in Vida's case, for example, but also as a society. Some of the women I've been around through the kind of delegations and being part of HAG's work really also point to just immediately being able to take a breath, reduce the level of anxiety, maybe not fully, but enough to actually function and participate more fully and in really healthful, good ways in our community. And that's what we really need. So that move towards housing, recognition of housing as essential infrastructure, it's like schools, it's like roads, it's electricity, it's hospitals. So thinking about housing as essential social infrastructure and the actual access to that infrastructure as a basic foundational human right are two of the ways that we're really starting to mobilise and push and shift the conversation. So there's a real moment in time at the moment. Things aren't moving quickly enough because anyone who's in a difficult situation today needs help now. But I do feel at least a hint of optimism after a long while of despair about the housing policy settings that are happening in Australia. There's also a move toward Um, I can't sing, so I won't launch into anything like that. But I'll just wrap up that I think that there's a real sort of move to thinking about innovation. So how can we think about housing cooperatives, for example? How can we think about expanding out the reach of shared equity schemes? Or what can we do to help people who are what HAG calls the missing middle population group, which are people maybe who have fallen out of home ownership for various reasons, mainly the cost of keeping up those payments. Sometimes people are sitting on maybe 100,000 in the bank, 200,000 in the bank. It's not enough to actually buy anything on their own without maybe a government support. But it's also too much to be eligible for social housing. So there's this sort of whole group of people. We know a lot of these people are women. We're doing work at the moment to try to estimate and just really identify the scale and the kind of makeup of this group of people. And we can really innovate in really interesting ways to think about how can that money that people have empower them in the way they really want to be empowered to get on with their lives in safe, secure ways, and so that people really can use that really hard-earned resource that they've developed over their life to empower them in later life. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, to keep these conversations going around housing as a right and how we innovate in really effective ways beyond thinking about traditional forms of individual home ownership or private rental as the only main options. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great, beautiful. So we've got enough time. So is there any questions or any comments from anybody? If not, I'll go to you, Jody. Oh, who's that? Someone's got. So B, I can only see B. Could you want to unmute and share this with us? Okay, so I've got Jill that's raised her hand. So why don't we go to you first, Jill, and then we'll come back to you. Gotcha.
Thank you, and thank you, Wendy, and also Susan and Vida. I had two questions. One was advocacy, and this was a question particularly for Wendy and Faith, I would think too, in terms of how, as just members of our society, the individual can use this information as part of advocacy, whether that be local council or their local member, state or federal, or also if they happen to be a member of a political party. The second question was healthcare. I'm a retired health practitioner. I am wondering from Susan and Vida, with all your experience as a nursing sister, what your opinions are of the kind of healthcare you have received through all of this, and what systems are in place, what the knowledge base is like in, for example, various components of the medical system or the nursing system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Why don't we go to you first, Vida, to answer around the healthcare, then we'll come back to Wendy for advocacy.
You don't want to hear my answer. Healthcare sucks. Since COVID, a lot of the doctors went online. It is very hard to find a doctor up front that will see you personally. I was under a good GP. She got so inundated that she ended up taking 6 months leave. So while she was away, I'd ring the surgery and say I need new scripts. Hey, I'm 75, hun. So then this doctor rings me up and says, it's on your phone. And it's like, what does that mean? I can't take it to the pharmacist. They'll sort it out. So the whole surgery went. Now I found another good GP, but it's very hard to find them that will bulk bill. And I basically look after my own needs. I'm fortunate enough that I look after my own needs. I don't rely on the medical profession to tell me how to live my life. There you go.
Thank you, Vida. Okay, why don't we go to you, Wendy, to answer the second question, Jill's second question.
Yeah, thank you, Faith. And thank you, Jill. Just maybe picking up first, just briefly on Vida's point too, that in other work I've been involved in, we just do find that there's this almost disconnection between various forms of social policy, health policy, economic policy, and housing policy. So we know that for older people, hospitals are really challenged when it comes to, for example, releasing older people from their care into the community after operations or any essential care, when they know that there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere for those people to go. So in the hospital setting, as well as actually in justice settings, we know that people are being held longer than they should be. For example, even in a sort of a jail situation. I know that's not your question, but the sort of the question gets to this sort of, what is the connection between these different systems? And the connection points really are very, very limited if they're there at all. So I really feel that there needs to almost be a housing impact assessment of anything across all fields of policy. So whether that's the family court, if people are going through divorce, separation, justice, if people have been victims of crime or perpetrators of crime, or any other aspects, including health, there really needs to be some of the supports we need from the housing part of our system need to be kind of triggered by those impact assessments in other forms of social policy, because everything is so interconnected. We know that precarity in housing doesn't come from nowhere. It's really about not only housing system failure, but this sort of failure of connection across systems, that people just fall through these cracks. It's very, very kind of easy to make that change, but it doesn't happen. So that's another point of advocacy. So getting to the advocacy point, I think doing what you're doing, Jill, asking the questions, getting to the forums, taking the research. The HAG report is publicly available online. The link, we might share it in the chat just when I stop speaking. We'll try to do that. But anything like this, I think writing to local members, going to those meetings, being as loud as possible, because one thing I know that is just really, really difficult is that, you know, sometimes when I've been appearing at events like this one, where people are speaking about their lived experience, it's actually just such a burden on people. It can be. Some people may thrive doing so, but for other people, it's just, I've heard, you know, an older woman said to me just quietly in doing this, you know, it doesn't get easier to tell my story. And I don't think that housing policy reform or change should depend on the people most damaged and harmed by system failure having to recount their story over and over again. So I think the more that we can rely on people's voices being amplified in videos or in infographics or through other people retelling their story of when they met their friend or their sister or whoever it is, the less burden on people directly affected. But engage, make noise. Have a look out for any kind of parliamentary sort of inquiries as well, because when there are things like at the moment, we've got a lot of action around housing policy reform, it's really possible for not only organisations to put forward suggestions, but for regular citizens. So the more that people's own perspectives are put forward, I think the better, the stronger the case is for change.
And the cost of food and the opportunity to exercise safely to maintain health as someone ages. That's a huge issue.
Yeah, the space and the safety to do all of these things, to really, you know, to have well-being in a very holistic way. Absolutely, housing's foundational.
Thank you. We're going to go to Kathy because you've had your hands up for a little while, and I know you've been putting a few things in the chat. Do you want to go, Kathy?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for this. It's great to hear everybody. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and thank you, Faith, for setting it up. Just one thing, because I have been hearing on the news about, you know, housing, and the one thing that hits me is that I think people have the right to a home, rather than looking at it just as a house, because when you're looking at housing, it becomes real estate. And so one sort of suggestion, and it might be a little ambitious, but no harm in being ambitious, is that if a person has to move out of their home, that they have the right to find themselves a new home of their choosing, wherever it may be, and the costs of the moving would be paid for by the person wanting them to move. So if, because it's more than, you know, it's like what you were saying about community, you know, I'm doing a creative work at the moment about Victoria Street in King's Cross in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, when property developers were given free rein, and their idea was, but it's just a whole bunch of old houses, you know, and we'll keep the trees, you know, because they could see 45-story development units and lots of money in it for them. And how could anyone not want that? Because they're just old houses. But those old houses house and are homes to people who have been there for 40 and 50 years. And it's their home, and not just their home, but they form part of a community. And it might take a community. How long does it take a community to evolve? And all those things that you're talking about, how much cost to a community to lose that cohesion that a community makes, that being knowing who your neighbour is, or not, going to the school. I don't have to sell this concept to anybody, but I do think that they're missing the point if they're talking just about the right to housing. I think it needs to be the right to a home.
Thank you, Kathy. So who would like to respond to that? Peter? Do we need a response? Wendy?
No, I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, great. Go, thanks, Peter.
So the guy I dealt with at Launch Housing was a huge advocate and a huge support for me. He found a place that he knew I would be suitable for rather than into a general housing co-op. And he found me a place where I could put my bed and put my head. I have converted that into my home. So the housing is the building, but what I've made of it inside is the home.
Thank you. Great. I know that Bee's been asking a few questions in the chat, so I just want to make sure you get a chance. Bee, did you want to ask your question? No? Okay, let me have a quick look. Can you read it? Oh, of course, I can read it. No problem.
Read it out.
Okay. Could we aim for the right? Is that the question? Could we aim for the right home rather than the house? I think we've just all talked about that. Unfortunately, that does not happen. Forced to get court orders and enforce them against developers while I am homeless. Not sure if I quite understand that question.
I
Someone wanna
understand that,
respond?
Faith.
Great,
Yeah.
go Kathy, you explain it to me.
Yeah, no, what she's saying is that from her original post, is that she had a home in Strata and a development corporation took over, borrowed 100 million to build something which made 78 people homeless. Now, a lot of those people would have been homeowners, right? But they couldn't, they were forced to get court orders to try and stop this property developer while they were homeless. You know, I mean, that's just there's a power imbalance there. If they're able to borrow 100 million because they want to put up this big thing and not make everybody in the existing place homeless, there should be some sort of, I suppose I'm going back to my other thought, that if a developer wants to do something like that, they really need it. It's not just about housing, it's about a person's home. And this person now is homeless. And they're trying to fight a big property developer who has $100 million. Who did they borrow it from? The government? I mean, who knows? They get all sorts of, you know, deductions for being out for making these, for putting up these buildings. I just think it's way too easy. that person who B should not have to, they should be, the onus should be on the developer to prove that they need to make, their proposition is way worth so much more than that person's home. But a home is far more valuable than a property. A home is everything. Yes, I understand what the other speaker was saying about making something into a home. But if she was fortunate, I think, and I'm glad that she had an advocate to find her a place that he felt was more suitable than a lot of other options. That's fantastic. And yes, we all make a home wherever we are as much as possible. But if we were forced to move every time someone wanted to make money out of the property itself, then the costs would be just too much to even move for some people. They could not pay moving costs. They would be homeless. And why should that be? You know, because the property developer wants to make money, and there's got to be a very good reason for that. And either they give them a place in their new property, you know, there's got to be a way to maintain the community as well as the community having a home, people having a home. It's the home thing that's gone out the window. The stability of a home. What happens if you lose that, if you're moving from place to place constantly, you know? And if you don't have the moving costs, there you pile into the car, if you have a car. Anyway, I won't rant anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I hope you got that across for you, B. I think you did that really well. Thank you. So Louise, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I just want to thank everyone very much. It was a really informative session. I'm just wondering, I mean, I've kind of taken notes of what we can do as an average person to advocate for more housing. I'm also just interested in the impact of, I didn't hear this, but it may have come up, I might have missed it, the impact of Airbnb on housing. Is that making a difference, particularly in areas, you know, such as holiday areas, coastal areas? I'm just wondering if anyone can speak on that.
So Wendy looks like she's going to be able to do that. I'm conscious of the time, so if anyone needs to slip away at 12, please do so. We'll just finish this question so we can really get the answer for Louise. Okay, over to you, Wendy.
Thank you. I'll be very quick because I think Dahlia's been trying to say something for a little while too. So Airbnb or short lets accommodation makes a huge impact where a full dwelling, whether that's an apartment or a townhouse or a freestanding house, is let out for short stay rental. We've done some work at Swinburne for the New South Wales Planning Commission, which led to some changes in Byron Bay recently. And those changes mean that we kind of looked at the tipping point where it made more sense for the investor to actually financially put the property back onto a long-term rental market compared with short-term rental, because the problem is at the moment, if it's a free-for-all, it's far more lucrative for people to have a short let if they're an investor. So it's actually getting that right. And what that meant in that case of Byron Bay is I think we're down to 90 days per year where that will be possible for somebody to let that out. The original proposition was going to be about 180. Our modelling showed that you had to bring it right down. And we hope that model will be rolled out in other councils. We think that's being looked at in WA and Shoalhaven at the moment. Even when Airbnb, I heard them recently over the last couple of days saying they're not the problem, they're definitely part of the problem.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Wendy. I know you said, Dahlia, I can't see you, but apparently you got your hands up. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Yes,
Dahlia?
thank you
Yeah,
very
great.
much. Thank you very much. I feel very lucky and grateful for my accommodation now, because my whole world fell apart, and like for 50 years I've been performing. I'm a performer. I've been performing in Australia everywhere, but mainly in a lot of old people's homes. You know, this was what I've been doing, and then so when my whole world fell apart and my partner passed away and lost my home and everything, they came up to me and that's the organization called Jewish Care, and they said, okay, you've been looking after us, now we're going to look after you. And they said they're moving you to a place in Little Bay called the Mirabuka Village, and it's a home. It's you get a unit. These organizations, they bought about 8-9 units there, and I received a unit that I will have for life. It's just tiny, it's 1 bedroom. That's it. It's a 1 bedroom unit with a balcony, but it's going to be mine forever. And I can close the door and go overseas and go away, but this place will be mine until the day I die.
That's a really great place to stop. Thank you so much, Dalia. Thank you for that. Great, our timing is perfect. I want to thank Wendy, Vida, and Susan. Thank you so much for your participation. And this is an ongoing issue and an ongoing, subject for us to keep working on. In terms of advocacy with Silver Sirens, we want to create a platform to have these conversations. We partner with Own Buy a Brick Foundation. The last 3 years, we've raised money for that particular foundation. We've just did an event in Adelaide that we partnered with Catherine House, who deals with homelessness and women. So that is our way just to continue the conversation and doing the little bit that we can. So we're really we're happy and privileged to be part of the solution, even if it's small. So I really want to thank everyone here today for allowing the conversation to continue. We cannot change anything we're not aware of, and that's the beginning. So I'm really grateful. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you. Feel free to, Jody, to stop the recording while I just do a little bit of housekeeping. Next,